Nice to see you this morning. I'm Allison Larr. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. I'm Allison Larr. I'm a director at Citigroup in our tax-exempt project finance group, and I cover circular economy projects, which includes anaerobic digestion and other sorts of projects that can use farm waste and produce something of value. By virtue of the types of projects I work on, many of our clients may also benefit from provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. So I'm going to cover tax-exempt bonds and certain tax credits that have been changed from the IRA just at a high level today. I know that we don't have too much time, so I'll keep it at a really an overview just to give you tools in case you weren't aware of these, and provide a little bit of information about them. So if you could switch to the next slide, please. So since you're all members of the audience today, you're aware that anaerobic digestion is a great opportunity for farmers to make use of biomass that's produced on their farms. And very simplistically, when we think about a project, there needs to be one, financing in order to construct that project, and two, ongoing generation of revenue. That's really high level, but if you break it down, those are two necessary elements for any successful project. And I'm going to talk about, just at a high level, one tool to use for construction financing. I know that we have Live Oak talking a little bit later about USDA financing, but the tax-exempt bond market can also serve as an option to finance projects to get them up through construction. And then once the project is constructed, the IRA has many different kinds of credits, but there's the investment tax credit, which is generated at the place in service date, and there's a production tax credit, which is generated as a result of ongoing production of product. And the two that I'm going to focus on today are Section 48 investment tax credit and Section 45 production tax credit. I'll also talk about a couple of caveats to these because there are a lot of different considerations in the IRA that limit the applicability of certain elements of these credits, and there are also a few new concepts that the IRA introduced that I just want to cover. This can be more of a dialogue. I don't need to go through the slides, one by one. So does anyone have questions before I get started on tax-exempt market applications? Okay. Next slide, please. So first of all, tax-exempt bonds, financing a project to get it to construction. If you're not familiar with tax-exempt bonds as applicable to farm-based anaerobic digestion, you may be familiar with them because they are the primary method that U.S. municipalities use to finance their state and local infrastructure. However, biogas projects fall under one of the exemption criteria for privately delivered projects. So projects that meet the qualifications for solid waste are eligible for tax-exempt financing. And the IRS defines solid waste very broadly. It's any used or residual material. And so used material would be like recycling something, but residual material includes biomass like manure or crop residue or food waste or any other kind of agricultural waste. So anaerobic digestion, by using these sorts of waste materials as a feedstock, qualifies for tax-exempt bonds. I'll also note that many biogas projects include wastewater treatment elements, and that's another applicable category for private activity bond or tax-exempt bond exemption. So there's two clear avenues for AD projects to use tax-exempt debt. Well, why am I talking about this? Why is it a benefit, and why is it a market to consider? Versus other different kinds of financing that might be available to projects, tax-exempt bonds typically have lower interest rates. So they're called tax-exempt because investors do not have to pay taxes on the interest that they earn, and that benefit gets passed on to the borrower. Right now, I think that the 10-year tax-exempt benchmark rate is probably around 65% of the 10-year treasury. So that's just a clear benefit. Our market also accepts LCFS and RINs revenue. So what Dave was talking about earlier, there's some risk associated with these revenue streams, but our market does accept the risk that comes along with projecting revenues that come from those sorts of credit programs. Our market also accepts non-traditional construction, feedstock, and offtake arrangements. I know that sometimes other financiers might need to have really locked up offtake arrangements, locked up feedstock arrangements. Our investors will do a lot of credit analysis to look into the details of arrangements that are possible, and they tend to take more risk versus other markets. There's also a demand for longer maturities. So other markets might need to have some sort of bridge loan where you have a short debt facility that needs to be taken out with a longer term facility at construction completion. Our bonds are long term from the beginning. So there's construction risk built into that. We often have some sort of call option where you can refinance the debt after construction to get a better rate when there's no more construction risk in the project. But if you do a tax-exempt financing to finance project construction, that would represent a permanent loan facility or a permanent bond facility for you. We also have a few other benefits like a less stringent covenant package, and it may be obvious from all the aspects that I just covered, but our market accepts credits that are below investment grade, so down to the B- category or so. In terms of the process for using tax-exempt bonds, it requires working with a municipal conduit issuer, which is an issuer or some sort of municipality that's set up to facilitate private issuance of tax-exempt bonds. There are a lot of different ones out there, and if you would want to explore this further, feel free to contact me or contact Citi to talk about what your options could be for conduit issuer. There's also a concept of volume cap. So the federal government allocates the ability for private developers to use tax-exempt debt according to each state, and each state gets an allocation based on its population. Each state also has the ability to give that allocation to different projects based on its own different prioritization methods. So there's some nuances there. It might sound complicated, but it's a process that is very well known. And if this is something that you're interested in, Citi would be happy to help walk through the details there. Any questions on tax-exempt bonds? I usually don't get any questions either when I start out at cocktail parties talking about this, so no surprise.
Allison, I have a quick question. How are these significantly different, or maybe they're not, from, say, like an industrial revenue bond?
That is you can consider them the same thing. So sometimes they're called industrial revenue bonds. Sometimes they're called private activity bonds. Sometimes they're called municipal bonds. They're all kind of the same thing.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay, so moving on to tax credits. I'm really going to cover this at a high level. There's a lot of detail in the bill, and we're also still waiting for guidance from Treasury and from the IRS about how exactly some of these credits can be applied. But for Section 48, this is an investment tax credit that's generated when a project is placed in service, and it applies to projects that began construction between December 2021 and January 2025. So that's an expansion projects. The cutoff used to be earlier for qualifying projects. The technologies that qualify were also expanded to include biogas, which is very relevant for this discussion, and then some other different technologies, including energy storage, microgrid controllers, and a few others. So those are the two main changes that are very broad. And then when we dig into the details here, the credit values start at a base credit of 6%, and then there's a multiplier to get up to 30% of project costs if certain prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements are met. So it's clear that the IRA is trying to incentivize prevailing wage and apprenticeship as part of project construction. So there's this pretty significant multiplier for the credit if those two requirements are met. There's also a couple of different additions, so credit adder concepts. There's one if certain domestic content requirements are met. So if the steel that's used is produced in the U.S., if other other parts of equipment are produced in the U.S., or if the project is located in an energy community, then there are these 10% bonus credit adders that can be applied to the credit. And then in January 2025, this tax credit will transition to Section 48E. Any questions on this slide?
So, Allison, we have a project that started construction last year, which is our High Tone project, and we got interconnected last year. So, for that, we were still on the last year's program, correct? This year.
That's a good question. I think that last year's program would still apply since it was placed in service last year.
Okay. Yeah.
Because it's projects that have construction commencing in 2022, not in service in 2022, are subject to the new credits.
Right. Yeah, and I think our Lentil project, which is commenced in 2022 but finishing in 2023, I think we have the opportunity, but but we can do both, right? There's a transition period where we could do both.
Yeah, and I think that that's where discussions with council will become important, and just making sure that the right program is applying to your project, just because some of the timing can get a little bit confusing.
Right.
Do we have any insight on the definition of the biogas side of things, like what would qualify, like the digester, the upgrader, the interconnection, like from a broad standpoint of like what does that mean?
I would have to look at the bill in greater detail. I don't have that level of granularity right now. Right. I think that I don't even know if the bill does go into detail there. I think that it just says biogas, and I think that we're going to need to have more guidance, frankly, about.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's where we've seen it too. It's like they added that one word, which is great, but we don't really have a great idea what that means in detail yet, from what I can understand. Yeah.
One of the big questions we had was, can we include depackager in it because it is part of the system? And I think that's the one that I think when you ask the USDA team, they're like, well, I don't think it includes depackager, but it's just it's a gray area there. It's not defined what the system is.
Yeah. And I mean, if we look at tax-exempt bonds and how solid waste and wastewater treatment facilities are defined, so for wastewater treatment, anything that's directly related to wastewater treatment or functionally subordinate qualifies. So if there's going to be internal consistency between the regulations, you would expect that to have a broader definition, but it's going to depend on, additional guidance from Treasury and IRS, and potentially upon precedents that are set as these credits are used more and more going forward.
And Allison, I don't mean to derail it too much, but and you might be talking about it here later, but could you maybe talk a little bit about the distinction between, I guess, RNG projects versus electricity projects as they relate to the IRA as well?
Yeah, I mean, so RNG can be sort of a precursor to electricity, as you know very well. So there are different definitions or different credits applicable to projects that produce electricity. So, for example, Section 45 production tax credit, which I'll cover on the next slide, is for projects that produce electricity using geothermal, solar, landfill gas, trash facilities, and biomass. But there are other specific credits that are available just to RNG. And there are some that are just broadly based on what the end use of the fuel is. So Section 45Z is for clean fuel, and the technology that goes into that clean fuel is kind of agnostic, in the regulations. So there's different credits that are applicable specifically to electricity or clean fuels, and others that are just specific to RNG. So I think that the text of the bill is something like 800 pages, and there's a lot of different additional expansions and credits that were added or modified. So there's a lot of different nuance about where there's where it's specific to the end product. Sorry if that was kind of a convoluted answer.
No, it's not. It's not. I know it's a big bill for sure, but yeah, thank you.
Sure. So talking about the Section 45 production tax credit, this is, once a project is up and running and it's producing electricity, there's a credit that's available for each kilowatt hour produced. And this is adjusted for inflation. This is for projects that began construction between December 2021 and January 2025. This expanded technologies a little bit to include solar. This new credit value of 0.3 cents per kilowatt hour is reduced from 1.5 cents, but that can be increased again by 5 times, similar concept as the 48 ITC, to 1.5 cents if those same sorts of prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements are met. There's also the same sort of bonus credits. So there's adders of 10% for the domestic content qualifier, and also for the energy community qualifier. So it's clear that there's additional incentives for using prevailing wage and for building projects in communities that qualify. Questions on this production tax credit?
So, Allison, is electricity, can they take both ITC and PTC, or is it you have to choose one? That's always a constant question.
Yes, and I include that on the next slide, additional considerations. So Section 48 and Section 45 can, in almost all instances, cannot be combined. However, there are some credits that can be combined with Section 48. So 45Z, the clean fuel production tax credit, can be. And we've talked about that before, and I went back to the advisor that we used, and he said he still had not found anything in the bill that prevents you from stacking up those credits. But electricity and the 48 ITC may not be combined, which, another limitation is that if you use tax-exempt bonds and you want to benefit from some of these tax credits, for some of tax credits, not all, there's a haircut applied to the tax credit because there's only, the government wants to limit how much you can benefit from these different sorts of financing methods. The ITC does not have a haircut. So if you use tax-exempt bonds and you want to get the Section 48 ITC, there is not a 50% discount on your ITC, so you would get 100% of the credit you normally would. But if you were to use, instead of the ITC, the PTC, there would be a credit applied. So that's a limitation. There's a cost-benefit analysis that will be unique to each project for what sorts of combinations of financing and credit generation are the best for you. So that's something that's going to be bespoke and just unique to each situation based on pricing and market conditions. A couple other concepts that the IRA introduced, which you may have heard about, but I just want to address a couple high-level points on. The first is direct pay. Direct pay is the ability for developers to receive cash in lieu of a tax credit, in case they don't necessarily have some sort of tax liability that they want to defer using these credits. For almost all credits, this direct pay is only available to governmental or tax-exempt entities. So tribals, the Tennessee Valley Authority, for example, However, for a few different credits, so Section 45Q, which is carbon sequestration, 45Z, and 45X, taxable entities can receive the direct pay. So that's, that can be a benefit if a credit is not valuable to you, if you'd rather have the cash. There's also the concept of transferability, which is where the tax owner of the project can sell that credit for cash. This is intended to, increase the supply of tax equity, and there's projected to be a supply-demand imbalance for this. So until we can really use transferability, we need more guidance from Treasury around the specific framework. So if there are any limitations on who can receive this or something like that, I think the market's waiting for a little bit more guidance from Treasury. Those are, some of the really high points about this bill that I think would apply here. And I just want to address, direct pay and transferability have had a lot of attention. And, it's not necessarily a silver bullet to help projects, but I think there's a lot of potential there. And, we'll just have to continue looking at how the market will assess this and how the government will give us more guidance to use these credits creatively and to help get projects up and running and to continue to benefit from different credit programs. So with that, I think I have a little page about who I am, and if you have any other questions, how you can contact me. But Rashi and Abu and Andrew, thank you very much for having me today, and I'm happy to answer any other questions that you might have.
Thank you, Allison. That was really informative. I had one question, just if you were aware of any guidance timeline from the government on, well, especially the 45Z production tax credits. So the production tax credits generated from renewable natural gas. It's a big question that's come up for us, and just wondering if you had heard anything about guidance coming through on that piece.
No, I have not. Usually it takes 6 months to a year for guidance to come out following these. So I would say hopefully later this year, but I really haven't heard anything specific about when we can expect more guidance, unfortunately.
Thanks.
Allison, I have a question, and I apologize if maybe this was mentioned and I missed it, but is there a way to capture the state tax credits, like investment tax credits that are available along with the federal ones I think we're speaking about here? Is that something you can speak to at all, or? So
I think that you should be able to, but I haven't seen anything specific addressing that.
Lauren, are there state tax credits in New York? I was not aware of that.
The agricultural or investment tax credit that's available for agriculture, for farmers, is in place. It's for really, kind of broad-based infrastructure expenditures. And I know that it has recently increased in total. I think it went from 5% to 20% pretty recently, but then there is a proposal for it to become refundable for 5 years. So that's a pretty big change. That if that's approved, that would, I think, open up an opportunity for some more funding for these types of capital expenditures.
That's pretty big. Okay. We should talk about that.
Yeah, it's in my presentation, but sort of all the way at the end, because it was just proposed this year by the governor. So in here.
That's something important to look into.
Mm-hmm.